Good morning, members of the North Carolina Senate and General Assembly. I hope you'll take a moment out of what I realize is a very busy schedule and allow me to share some thoughts about the critical importance of your vote on North Carolina House Bill HB 585. I know as lawmakers, you're constantly reviewing proposed legislation and interacting with respective constituents regarding these laws. I'm guessing because of this, you've likely heard from more than a handful of concerned citizens and even lobbyists seeking your attention about this bill. If you'll kindly allow me just a few minutes to go over some of the background that has brought me here today, digitally speaking, of course, I'll go over some developments regarding the trauma of child sexual abuse that you may or may not already know about. First, a little bit about myself. I'm a survivor of pre-sexual abuse. When I say survivor, I mean this in the truest sense of the word. Every day is a test of my survival and overcoming a spectrum of symptoms resulting from the trauma I endured as a victim of sexual assault. The sexual assaults perpetrated against me by a Catholic priest occurred after my family relocated from a town in California to a small North Carolina town of Albemarle. I was a precocious and admittedly somewhat introverted and demonstrably sad 14-year-old seeking support because of an abusive environment that I was subjected to in my home. It has long been established that troubled kids already struggling in troubled homes, are the most vulnerable and commonly targeted by pedophiles and child sex predators. The repeated sexual assaults that I was subjected to occurred in the rectory living room, on the floor, and have impacted me throughout my life. However, it wasn't until about age 42 that I began to realize that the many, many ways that what happened was negatively affecting me. Before then, I hadn't made the connection in my conscious mind about what had happened, or the nuanced and subtle yet profound ways I'd been affected. The vast majority of which remained well submerged under the radar until my mid-40s. It was then that certain patterns in my behavior and emotions emerged in ways I just could no longer overlook, including undeniable elements of psychological conditions and instances of complete and utter despair and dysfunction. Subsequently, I have been hospitalized in a psychiatric unit, local hospitals, as well as hospitals throughout the country, a total of 10 times since 2004. Each of these hospitalizations have cost in a range ranging from $15,000 to $30,000. Devastating costs associated with the trauma that I've endured. I filed civil and criminal charges in 2009, and after 5 years of litigation beginning in 2010, my civil case was ultimately barred and dismissed due to the North Carolina Statute of Limitations regarding child sexual assault. This is the very law that North Carolina HB 585 purports to revise. The revision proposed in HB 585 will allow survivors of child sexual abuse like myself, who've struggled during an entire life to overcome the traumatic damage resulting from the absolute atrocities perpetuated against them as innocent children by someone that they likely regard with utmost respect and deference. The odds of success are greatly against survivors who don't have access to proper treatment. It's expensive, and typically one's earning capacity and ability to function becomes compromised, making it difficult to simply pay for basic living expenses, as in my case. There is, however, an important footnote. In the case of Catholic priests, parishioners are conditioned and taught that priests are surrogates and advocates for God. Many in our society ask why someone who, as an innocent child who was raped or sexually assaulted by one of the pillars in their scope of authoritative power, doesn't go to the authorities to disclose what happened. Expecting an innocent and highly traumatized child, the victim of a heinous violation of personal space and adult sexual acts, to disclose such an unreal and devastating accusation about an avatar of God is simply naive and unrealistic. More so, considering the majority of victims of sexual assault are so often met with angry disbelief and what essentially results in blaming the victim. What child would choose to subject themselves to such punishment and re-victimization? They're likely already well down the path of self-blame and belief that what happened was their fault. And sadly, it is very common that victims will also be told that the assault was, on some level, their fault at some point. It's not difficult to understand this scenario when you understand the nature and psychology of children, highly traumatized children. In my case, I also filed criminal charges which, after repeated court appearance postponements, citing health and ambulatory restrictions over 5 years by the defendant, were dismissed when a judge in Charlotte ruled the defendant incapable of participating in court proceedings due to dementia. During litigation, because the Church and Charlotte Diocese failed to disclose that the defendant confessed to all charges when he was arrested, I was also subject to online attacks, accusations, and denigration by a group of 1,300 supporters who congregated on Facebook in a group called Justice for Father Kelleher. It wasn't until after the assistant district attorney filed a motion in court in 2012 citing the defendant's confession that the Facebook suddenly disappeared within 2 hours. I've still not recovered from this devastating abuse because I've had no access to treatment. A psychologist might characterize my condition as being a type of arrested development in the absence of appropriate treatment. Well, because of my condition of dysfunctionality, I had no choice but to apply for disability benefits in 2009. To this day, my only hope of recovery and a chance at a normally healthy and productive life is gaining access to treatment. Very specialized and very expensive treatment. Treatment that is specific to child sexual abuse trauma. The only way I'll gain access to this expensive and specialized treatment is through a settlement for damages with the Charlotte Diocese. If charges and civil action were pursued before I had turned age 21, my case would have been open and shut in my favor, no doubt. And my life would have been considerably different without such dramatic, suffocating suffering. Since the appellate ruling in my civil action in the summer of 2015, I have personally been engaged in my own effort to negotiate some type of agreement with the diocese to provide treatment for my recovery. Those close to me have not had great expectations from this effort, and it has been incredibly difficult, but I felt I had to give it a try. After 10 months of back and forth with the Charlotte Diocese representative, I recently had to close my dialogue with them because they were clearly playing cat and mouse with me. Matter of fact, they even ended paying for a therapist because I could no longer afford transportation and haven't had a car for 2 years due to my financial circumstances. The Catholic Diocese was quite arrogantly refused to make an apology despite my repeated requests. Something I should never have to request to begin with, obviously. Remember, their priest confessed to all charges during his arrest. The Charlotte Diocese, with a smile on their face, has simply ignored my repeated requests for an apology. Along with all of this turmoil comes a psychological diagnosis so common in survivors of childhood trauma. Treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD are all typical disorders that emerge in circumstances that have recently been linked to actual neurological damage resulting from exposure to incidents of childhood trauma. And speaking about neurological damage, I'd like to share with you some very profound research results regarding what happens to the brains and psyche of children who are victims of sexual assault. Before I do that, I'd like to let you know about a gentleman in Australia who's dedicated his career to examining and researching this very profound set of circumstances that prevent children, victims of sexual trauma, from pursuing legal remedy or even going to the authorities. His name is Dr. Ben Matthews. He operates out of Sydney, I believe, and he's pursuing the revision of tolling criteria because he has evidence to show that there is good reason that these child victims who have been traumatized do not go to the authorities. Statistics show this clearly. I'd like to share with you what's been reported through a series of research projects undertaken by the U.S. Department of Justice through an organization named Changing Minds Now. The focus of this research addresses the effect of trauma to the delicate and developing brains of young children. The resulting impact in the event early intervention is delayed or absent altogether, which is typically the case. While not specifically just about child sexual assault, researchers investigated a variety of experiences in which children were exposed to crimes, violence, and abuse in their homes, mostly perpetrated by relatives and caretakers, as well as the occasional stranger. It's devastating to learn that almost 60% of American children are exposed to at least one instance of traumatic experience during their upbringing. That's an enormous number, and as responsible adults, it's now difficult to see this is a fundamental contributor to the many varieties of dysfunctional behavior occurring with increased frequency by the adult survivors of exposure to childhood trauma. Researchers at Changing Minds Now were able to more intimately evaluate these impact factors and were able to identify distinct neurological damage resulting from the very vulnerable nature of the plastic developing fragile neuropathways in the context of direct exposure to trauma. Researchers found previously unattributed damage to these neuropathways resulting from trauma associated with child sexual assault can be characterized as contributing factors to what so often can be characterized as an avalanche of various neuropathic detriment and damage. Simply put, the exposure of the delicate minds of children to trauma had been determined to actually cause neurological damage, the rewiring of neuropathways in their brains. Dr. Matthews in Australia cites this very fact in addressing lawmakers and making the argument to revise tolling, the act of stopping the clock when it comes to statute of limitations window in which survivors can bring legal action. Matthews asserts that it is unrealistic to impose such limitations on victims who, as a result of the trauma introduced by sexual assault, aren't readily able to engage in legal proceedings, for good reason. Matthews is an advocate in his country for revising laws similar to ours. It would almost be like denying justice to someone whose legs were chopped off illegally because they couldn't walk to the courthouse. Researchers at Changing Minds Now underscore the critical importance of early intervention, now considered a key factor in mitigating potential neurological damage, which will likely emerge as the primary determining factor affecting whether a survivor is susceptible to psychiatric diagnoses later in life. Currently, especially given the small percentage of disclosure by survivors of child sexual abuse, these survivors are relegated to going through life physiologically damaged and disadvantaged, greatly disadvantaged. A disability imposed on us involuntarily and without laws to making certain that whenever possible, the culpable and complicit are held responsible. Frankly, I don't see myself as someone you would typically see in this context, in a video, or otherwise addressing lawmakers, the caretakers of laws that make the state of North Carolina and our country so great. But here I am. I'm here because this issue isn't going away. Children deserve to be protected from the vile perpetrators who commit these atrocities. They also deserve to be protected after the fact, and right now, we are failing them. In closing, I also want to share with you the recent launch of the IRCP by New York's Cardinal Timothy Dolan, number 2 beneath the Pope. The IRCP was created last year, supposedly created to offer independent access for survivors of pre-sexual assault who were previously barred from civil litigation, someone like myself, to engage in negotiations to settle claims for damages. Why is this happening? Well, because Timothy Dolan knows the impending nature of the changes in the court with respect to statute of limitations and the ultimate financial vulnerability he will be facing. Dolan had done this in the shadow of proposed legislation to revise their state statute of limitations, which has failed to pass despite repeated efforts. I believe this is a tactic intended to control the access survivors could gain from such legislation when it ultimately passes and becomes law. This way, the North Carolina Diocese can avoid costly litigations and court proceedings to take advantage of vulnerable survivors who simply want justice so they can salvage what remains of their lives. Senators, I greatly appreciate your attention and hope by indulging me. And I hope you'll find what I share with you worth consideration when you cast your vote for NC HB 585. You probably know that the bill was introduced by your colleague in North Carolina, in the North Carolina Congress on April 6, 2017. This bill, I predict, will very likely share a list with the most important bills you will make into North Carolina law in 2017, if not decades. Thank you for your time, and I hope you'll do the right thing and vote yes on HB 585. Thank you very much.